Do you see anyone in the audience?
Okay, so now we're live, and I'm going to do a little cue on the promo. So, and after that, I'll make a little introduction, and then we'll get going.
Okay.
You got
Sounds
it.
good.
The Guyana Business Journal and the Caribbean Policy Consortium presents Transforming Guyana. In each episode, Dr. Blackman and Dr. Lewis will tackle a different area of interest for transforming Guyana.
Good morning, and colleagues, and welcome to Transforming Guyana Season 3, Episode 11. Yes, Season 3, Episode 11. We've met here second Wednesday of every month for the last 3 years. So on behalf of the Guyana Business Journal, I want to thank you for joining today's conversation. Diaspora Bonds, Trust, Identity, and Infrastructure in Guyana's Development Journey. I am your host, Dr. Terrence Blackman, Chair and Professor of Mathematics at Medgar College in the City University of New York, and the founder of the Guyana Business Journal and Magazine. As is always the case, I'd like to just take a few minutes at the beginning to say something about our mission at the Business Journal. You know, we aim to foster critical dialogue and thought leadership with the goal of securing an open, prosperous, and inclusive Guyana, where all Guyanese, regardless of race, class, background, can share equitably in our nation's economic future. This Transforming Guyana series platform is intended to create a space to engage experts and thought leaders from Guyana, the Caribbean, and diaspora on our economic transformation. We aim to examine opportunities and challenges of the economic expansion in the oil and gas era, and to explore policies and strategies ensuring that the growth translates into broad-based sustainable development, and most importantly, as you might expect, to identify roles for the diaspora in shaping Guyana's evolving economic landscape. Today, we're quite pleased to, we gather really at a critical moment in Guyana's development story. You know, the economic trajectory has shifted dramatically with the rise of the oil and gas industry. And yet still the challenge now is to ensure that this moment becomes a foundation for long-term inclusive prosperity. And we believe that this requires bold and creative thinking about financing mechanisms that mobilize capital while deepening participation and strengthening trust and reinforcing institutional credibility. And diaspora bonds, we believe, represent one such mechanism, kind of connecting patriotic sentiment, financial capacity, and developmental need. Yet they raise some profound questions about identity, about trust, about the institutional scaffolding that's necessary for viability. And we wanted to explore this. We wanted to think critically about this. You know, could a diaspora bond work in a Guyanese context? And if yes, how would it work? And we're really honored to welcome Dr. Aleksandr Gevorkyan, a leading voice on diaspora finance and development economics, who will guide us through global precedents and some practical considerations. Dr. Gevorkyan serves as the Henry George Chair in Economics, and he's a professor of economics at St. John's University here in New York City. He's a macroeconomist who holds a PhD from the New School, specializing in open economy, macroeconomics, economic development, diaspora economics, and I noted post-socialist transitions, which I think all align very nicely with Guyana. And his research explores how diaspora communities can meaningfully participate in homeland development through these financial instruments, such as diaspora bonds. So we'll invite Dr. Gevorkyan to kind of educate us, and following his presentation, we'll try to engage in a dialogue grounding some of these ideas in the Guyanese experience. So I look forward to your questions in this regard, and I welcome Dr. Gevorkyan to help us to understand a bit more about diaspora bonds. The floor is yours.
Terrence, thank you very much for this invitation, for the very kind introduction. I'm really glad to be participating in these discussions, and for various reasons. The obvious one is my interest in development economics and topics surrounding that, but also through my personal connections with Guyana, through my colleagues and friends and co-authors. There's quite a bit to discuss for us together. But there's also a third dimension, and that is, well, by way of my Armenian background, Guyana does sound like an Armenian woman's name. So, there's something in that as well. But also, on a different note, but also related to the two countries, is that both are small open economies, and there are some similarities. The more I talk to my colleagues from Guyana, we discover, not entirely, but some similarities in terms of sort of common challenges that small countries are facing. So let's dive into it. My title sort of gave away, or perhaps gives away, kind of my view on this instrument, but let's build up towards it, right? My research sort of record on this, as you mentioned, I was going to use this as my introduction, starts with the post-socialist economies, continues with them economies of Central Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, but evolved into the sort of questions of diaspora economics as well, because diaspora, and what we understand as diaspora, has become a major player in these economies. But generally speaking, I think we have to keep in mind, just as a conceptual framework for our discussion, sort of the three pillars of development, or three dimensions, if you will. Number one is the sort of the competitive economic structure of the country, what it is that the economy does, right? And plus the labor market and so on. Related is the social welfare, how people just feel being in that country. Because if we see high levels, rates of migration out of the country, something is not working the way it is and should be working, right? And then thirdly, there's the institutional dimension, and that's the gradual change of institutions, norms, which is, by all definitions, is deeply rooted in country's history, and objectively is dependent on sort of these country-specific processes, aside from the general popular frameworks of these days. And all of this is very dynamic. That's the idea behind this chart here. Now, to move forward with this sort of intro statement, we are living indeed in very interesting times, as things are changing rapidly, and the restructuring of global value chains and repositioning of production from one country to another, sort of global competition, plus now in the context of Guyana, discovery of oil and how that is transforming the country. So one of the key common questions for small economies is to figure out their development model, right? And there are many alternatives. I have 5 here, but I would welcome suggestions to extend the list or shorten it and make it more sort of concise. But one is try to just either pick one sector that will pull all of the other sectors with it, or somehow provide sort of incentives for the macro sector development overall. Second is to integrate with trading partners, and we see that, for example, in Central Europe, with former socialist economies integrating almost entirely with European Union. Third is just to leave things as they are and hope that something works out. And then fourth is try to cooperate, which is difficult to accomplish for geographic distances or reasons for just different views on economic development and so on. But it's a cooperation mechanism among small economies. And then the fifth, finally, is this diaspora promise. And that's where sort of we are going to go in next. Let me just switch the slides. Now, all of these sort of ideas are great, but the big question is how to finance that, right? And how to pay for all that. Because any one of them could be viable in the context of a specific country. And this is where this diaspora promise comes up. And before, I usually bring this at the end, but should probably start with the beginning for an audience that may not be familiar with the context. And that is the following. We often mistake a process of migration with a phenomenon of diaspora, right? Indeed, diaspora is created through migration of people from one place to another. But it is a much more complex and multifaceted phenomenon than just simply talking about migration. Now, these are some of the definitions that I have, and Dr. Khachaturian is the founder, essentially, of diaspora studies, and his is that it's not sort of just an accident birth. It's with individuals living outside of their ancestral homeland, but he emphasizes this hybrid subjectivity, the lack of collective practices that underscore their difference from one another and so on, right? And from others as well. I try to synthesize this in a network sort of view of culturally or nationally affiliated individuals with some common background outside of borders of their perceived native land. Now, why is all this important? Is because one way we think about diaspora, we tend to, again, as I mentioned before, look at just the current migration rates. And this is going to be very, very important when we get to the actual diaspora bond conversation. Because this view of sort of migration-based diaspora or recent migration is kind of influencing a lot of discussions, but at the same time, it's missing some of the big points. And here's one example. In this popular chart, Armenia's diaspora is estimated to be 27% roughly, right? But notice Guyana is at the top, by the way, 36%. Well, I will not say anything strong about Guyana, but as far as Armenia, this number is absolutely incorrect, because this just reflects over the past 20 or 30 years, migration of people with Armenian passports abroad, right? But what we know historically, again, I'm clicking on the wrong clicker, should be here. What we know historically is that, and this is not coming up the way it's intended, but there's a map which shows the spread of Armenian diaspora across sort of the world with long history of that. In other words, what I'm trying to get to is that yeah, for some reason on my side, the map is not showing up, but hopefully the audience can see it. But what is interesting in this case is that this phenomenon of diaspora is a product of not just migration, but migration plus history, or maybe multiplied by history. And in the case of Armenian diaspora, this has been ongoing for centuries, right? And what's interesting is that those pockets of diaspora, and again, Armenian diaspora, have existed and continue to function in very different modified ways. And we often try to refer to them as diaspora networks, but as we dive deeper, we realize they're not really connected as much as we imagine them. Now, this has very practical implications. This sort of high-level abstract thought has very practical implications once we get to the Minister of Finance and we start talking about issuing a new debt instrument, right? So let's continue with the conceptual for a moment. So the way I approach this is from, again, three sort of directions. The first one is the identity, and that's where an individual living abroad identifies themselves as a citizen of the country where they live or a resident, but for some non-tangible, sort of intangible kind of motivations, associates himself or herself with another country, right? So we have lots of phenomena. Irish Americans is the number one, right? Americans, but remembering their Irish background. So this is the identity that I have in mind here. The second sort of foundational point is trust. And this is where this trust evolves over time and through practice, through different interactions among those individuals living abroad. So within, let's, for simplicity and reference, call this diaspora group or network. But also that this trust has to be developed between this sort of diverse and dispersed group of individuals with that ancestral country, that whichever we have in mind. Guyanese Americans with Guyana, Irish Americans with Ireland, and so on. And all of that is good, but for anything to be tangible and sustainable, and especially if we talk about in terms of financial and financing development, there needs to be some sort of infrastructure provided by the receiving state. So that's what we are talking about. Now, when we talk about identity, right, this is the immediate sort of tangible or material sort of way of referring to that would be to look at remittances. So these are the labor migrant remittances sent back home, and again, the World Bank is a champion and strong advocate for that channel as being one of the key drivers in terms of development, and rightfully so, because we can look at sort of, this is the overall global pattern. You can see the remittances being the most stable of all other flows into the developing countries, right? And if we look at the recipients, we find something like Tajikistan, for example, up to 40% of GDP, or Lebanon with 31% of GDP attributed towards the remittances inflows, or rather the share of remittance inflows index. And then in terms of the actual numbers, again, there's very high sort of volumes by country. But what is interesting in this country view in terms of volumes is that there is the dominance of India, Mexico, China. But when we get into the smaller countries, these total values are not as high. So that's a bit of a concern. Very quickly, two more charts. But again, this is the former socialist world. Tajikistan is at the top. The next with the Kyrgyz Republic. But gradually, over the period of time, over the past 20 or 30 years, roughly, the role that remittances have played in GDP has been declining. And what is interesting is that that indeed there's strong poverty alleviation effect, but is it really contributing to something bigger? Now, we also have some data from Guyana. Again, it's important to look at the levels as well as the percentage share of GDP. And what is changing here is obviously the discovery of oil and the immense growth to GDP that Guyana receives. I think this is roughly since 2019, right? So the share of remittances starts to decline. Okay, why is all this relevant? Is because remittances is number one argument that is brought up in conversations on diaspora bond. We can issue a diaspora bond because we have been receiving this and much billion in remittances on an annual basis. But my 5 sort of cautionary points on this is that that's fine, that's very good, but it's not a sufficient condition, right? And the small recipient country is dependent on the large country's business side. So whichever the country is, that is sort of, we can talk about sort of Central American, South American countries dependent on the economies of the United States, or maybe even Canada, right? So a downturn in the U.S. economy will negatively impact the remittances inflow to those smaller countries. In Eastern Europe, that would be European Union, UK. In Central Asia, Caucasus, that would be the business cycles of Russia. Second, remittances are preconditioned by migrants' personal ties to their families. So this is a point on lacking of common good, and it's been discussed in literature, and it very much influenced, also helped me formalize some of my intuitive thoughts on this. Third, it's the scale. We just saw that there's a group of countries that are getting the bulk of that, which then paints a very nice overall picture, but country specific, we need to be cautious. And then actually, I already mentioned common good. And then there's the more technical question of macroeconomic imbalance. This is, in simple words, when there's a lot of US dollar or other euros or other hard currency inflow into a developing economy, especially a small economy, there's a challenge of absorbing all this so-called foreign exchange, foreign currency. And oftentimes that leads to the local currency's appreciation, which then hurts that country's exports, which has much longer negative ramifications and consequences for the country's economy, right? Instead, a lot of these remittances are spent on immediate consumption needs. And again, it's a massive effect in poverty alleviation, but still, this is not sufficient for a properly structured debt instrument. And this is where we come to trust. Trust within the network, across the country, within the diaspora network, across and with the country, which requires time. And we should remember that a negative experience offsets all the good. It takes just one negative experience. So, but can diaspora bonds solve all these questions? A little bit of history. In my findings, and I welcome, again, as one well-known German political economist once stated, I welcome an informed critique. Otherwise, let it be. So if there is anything, I would be thankful for this. But in my findings, it was the still unrecognized Republic of Ireland that issued what we could describe as the first diaspora bond, because the specific appeal was to the Irish Americans, and the roadshows were done in the United States in 1919, 1920. And that was a successful sort of fundraising campaign. The clause, in terms of repayment clause, was conditional upon the country's achieving its independence from Britain. Now, as history would have it, the period would be very difficult, so it would take some time, I think about 16 or so years. So by mid-1930s, only then the repayments started to take place. The next would be an attempt to do something similar out of China. But really, when we talk about diaspora bond, we have two countries in mind these days, Israel and India. And again, to be brief on this, because I do have a lot of pictures to show, but I'll try to be brief.
No, don't rush. I mean, I'm already enthralled by the story. So
all right, okay.
Yeah,
so
don't rush.
Again, there may be. All right, so there may be. We can find smaller attempts and calls to national unity and so on, but in terms of its significance and actually influencing the entire discussion, it's been Israel's success with what has become known as diaspora bonds, or Israel bonds, right? First launched in 1951, and since then, as of this sort of year, early this year, the country was able to raise $53 billion. Never defaulting, maintaining top sovereign ranking ratings, and so on. Now, this is a very comprehensive program. This is not a one-off. And to me, that's an important factor for anyone talking about diaspora bond to consider. Israel went into this at the time when it was just formed. In today's language, it was a developing economy, maybe an emerging market. And we know that, I mean, the markets are more or less developed these days, but in the past, the international capital markets were really punishing, right? And so for a small country to attract the needed foreign exchange, it was an incredible challenge. So this is where the calculation went into, okay, we should appeal to diaspora. And the appeal was, again, I'm so used to changing slides on my computer. So the appeal was really, really broad scale, right? With road shows and individual meetings, creating a development corporation for Israel, and pleading with the supporters across the global Jewish community to support this idea, right? Some of the language that made this a diaspora bond is included in the prospectus of these are from the recent issues, but if we go back further, there's even more specific language that says that these are the bond offerings that have special appeal to, as the text says, to persons with an interest in the state of Israel, rather than the general public. These days, these statements are also clarified with the statement that, but if you're interested in something more sort of competitive in terms of returns, we have other bonds that you can consider. And this is really good in terms of what we're talking about in terms of a diaspora bond. So we have a country that has a clear sort of debt management and operational model where there's some proposition specifically for diaspora, or in this case, anyone with interest in supporting the country. And second, we have just general instruments, but those general instruments would evolve later. Again, the diaspora bond was needed to break into the capital markets. And that's also an important point. But these days, Israel is continuing its program, and what you see here, what's shown on the screen, is screenshots from the website of the Development Corporation of Israel, with describing a myriad of different options of how to invest in terms of the minimum subscription as low as $36, right? So it's very accessible, but these very low minimum subscription levels also suggest that anyone investing in this is not really investing for the money, even though there will be a return. But it's more of an emotional, altruistic connection. And what is common in the literature, talking about diaspora and diaspora bond.
Can I? That's just a really silly question. I had the thought.
Give me a chance to drink some water. Yeah.
Yeah. Can like, would it be a case where like a private corporation could set up a diaspora bond independent of a government? Do you think that could happen? Or any examples of that?
That's a very good idea. It's possible, but let's come back to this question. I'm going to write this down in a few moments. Let me just finish with this story here, because there's something very important that we need to mention. So private corporation. What worked in the case of Israel, right, was that, and continues to be, is I emphasize the aspect of trust, right? That the country went out there, studied its diaspora, or with dispersion, which is the original term or meaning from the Greek language from which we have the word diaspora. And understood the needs of that diaspora and concerns and sort of reservations, right? And tried to work with that. This is very important. In other words, you're taking a self-critical look and saying, okay, what am I doing wrong? Let me fix this, because my end goal is to fundraise. Second, there was clear transparency. It was obvious for what these bonds were and these days you can still track that, infrastructure projects and so on. Third, there's the financial legitimacy, and that is maintaining very prudential, very careful debt management profile. But what also helped, and this continues to play a role, was in a guarantee that was extended by the U.S. Treasury in the 1990s, and it continues to be renewed, implicitly supporting sort of the debt issuance. So that gives for any risk-averse investor some sort of comfort that, okay, there will be somehow they can recover their funds in the case of default. But the bonds are now so popular that they are even included in different municipalities across the United States in the portfolio management of those municipalities. Okay, so we'll come back to private. Actually, we can talk about this next, and that is in the case of India, because India's sort of connection with its diaspora was not as simple, not as immediate, but really started to sort of blossom, we should say, in the early 90s. And there were 3 attempts to set so-called diaspora bonds: India Development Bonds, Resurgent India Bonds, and India Millennium Deposits. None of these actually turned out to be the true bonds in the context, in the way a fixed market analyst understands, in the way a finance minister sees their debt portfolio. These were more of a either foreign currency deposits or some type of foreign currency accounts that India opened through private commercial banks. Now that allowed to access this wide diaspora across the world and connect that way. What India did not do, but Israel did do, was issue these bonds in the United States. When Israel did that, they registered their bonds with the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is a required step for any sovereign or private corporation issuing debt and actively promoting that to U.S. residents, right? But that also brings, as Argentina would discover eventually, that brings certain obligations, right? And which means you're subject to the interpretation of the contract by the U.S. courts. Now, these technicalities may be a little bit boring, but they are a massive sort of game changers in all of this. I'll skip this slide not to talk too much.
No, don't skip anything. This is a very interesting discussion.
Well, okay, we have a lot. So then we have examples from other places. So Bangladesh has tried wage earner development bonds, which I believe are still in practice, but these are essentially this is essentially a channel for sort of sending remittances again through the deposits. In 2019, not going in the chronological order, but in order in terms of my interest, I guess. In 2019, Pakistan placed a bet on the remittances that they were receiving. Right, they noticed that they have, in 1 year, they were managed to attract $21 billion of remittances, which was roughly 7% of GDP. And they said, okay, let's issue a diaspora bond, and we will aim for 1 billion. But they only raised 26 million. Right, so this would become a major disappointment. The reasons was lack of trust from diaspora investors, political sort of disagreements, of course, lack of clarity how the money would be spent, and in general risk aversion by those investors. And instead, again, the decision was made to create, rather to set up an infrastructure that will allow foreign investors or affluent Pakistanis across the world to open foreign exchange accounts in the country. And so that's going to be a common feature in what I'm going to talk about. 2007, Ghana tried the same, but only raised 40% of their target. And 94% of the investors were domestic investors. So we may call it a diaspora bond, but if close to 100% are from within the country, what makes it a diaspora bond?
Mm-hmm.
Kenya has had 2 attempts and relatively successful in a way that they were able to raise the funds, but again, not as much as they would hope, and it all comes back to questions of trust.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have Ethiopia, which was a very successful case. They did advertise them as diaspora bonds. This had specific uses. Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. They were able to raise funds they were hoping for, and that everything was fine. They worked with, I think, one of the U.S. banks to do that because you can't do it on your own. But they forgot to, or somehow omitted to do something that would be very important and decisive, and that was to register those bonds with the SEC. And as a result, just a few years later, after the issuance, SEC orders the country to refund the entire 6.5 million they raised plus interest and fees back to the original investors. The reason is that raising funds in the U.S. through a sovereign debt instrument requires registration, because that serves as a protection for the investors, right? Domestic investors, and so on. As I mentioned, in terms of the bank deposits, there's a whole literature on Islamic banking which may be relevant here, but I usually leave it outside of this presentation. So let's move on to one other case, final case in my sort of list of case studies, and that is Nigeria, because by all indications, it has been incredibly successful. Nigeria issued a diaspora bond. They were able to raise $300 million. Now they recently announced they would try a new issuance, and then we need to read the fine print. And there are 2 points on the fine print. Number one, 300 million is really a small change in Nigeria's overall debt portfolio, which is in billions of dollars, right? So that is probably something we can experiment with. But now that it's successful, we can try and go for more. But this brings us to point number 2. If we read the prospectus, which is the legal documents, right, that basically that's the birth certificate of a bond, which defines what they are. We find the language there that says that these bonds are open to, let's say, people of Nigerian descent, right? But also all qualified investors, which is everyone, right? So again, there's what makes this a diaspora bond? We don't really have that in here. And I think these are important factors. Trust, right? So assuming that we can connect with our diaspora. So we've covered the identity part. Second is, well, we need to build trust. And a diaspora bond is a legal document, which kind of puts that understanding of trust on paper. Right. Now, Guyana could try this. In fact, it could, if it did, it could even be very similar to the case of Nigeria. Right. So this is from the IMF's, I think it's Article 4, it's the debt review article, and they're very optimistic in their assessment. Right. IMF estimates that Guyana's oil production will continue, or at least they report this, will continue to rise, and that will lead to a greater allocations towards the Natural Resource Fund, and on the top chart, as those allocations increase and reaching close to something 30 or something 35% of GDP, right? The overall debt portfolio will actually start looking better as a share of GDP. Debt will either decline or be stable. Great. So, and then if we look at one more thing, if we look at macro, again, we're seeing improvement. Expected growth rate of 14% annual in the next 5 years. This is incredible for a small country with roughly 850,000 people, right? Unbelievable. So that could be sort of well, attempting maybe sort of factor or aspect that may create some preconditions for Guyana to issue purely diaspora bond, registering it with SEC if we want to.
Sorry.
That's okay. Registering with SEC if we do want to target the Guyanese in the United States, but that is the bulk of the diaspora, right? It's United States and UK. Okay. What's appealing in this case is that there is a tangible asset that generates revenues. That's the resources, the oil resources, and so that at least helps with sort of managing the perceptions of risk. Generally, when we talk about diaspora bonds, we have an idea that our diaspora investor is so patriotically driven that we can expect a patriotic discount, meaning that the government issuing the bond can expect lower costs. And in financial markets, this is measured by the yield. So the higher the yield, the higher is the cost, so to speak, that the government has to pay back. But it is the higher the yield is also the higher the return to the investor. But if we're dealing with the diaspora investor, then probably we can count for sort of their altruistic motives and expect a lower yield, so lower return for investors, but it also means more money coming to the country. Again, possible, and the oil reserves and the way things are expected to go may serve as that important sort of external factor, right, that can support something like a diaspora bond. Essentially, that's what Nigeria did. I guess that's my conclusion of this, because Nigeria issued something that it called diaspora bond. It was open to everyone, but because the country can rely on its oil revenues, it was pretty much a safe bet. Okay, so let's keep this in mind. But a reminder here that we are dealing with a binding contract, and it's not just a contract as a sovereign debt or as a debt instrument would be sort of designed just out of practice of fixed markets and government debt, but it is actually a contract with diaspora. So you cannot, this is probably even the highest demand in terms of performance, national performance. So whatever we promise, we must try our best to deliver in this case. And if a diaspora, if there is an instrument that is issued as a diaspora bond, but it ends up being just a general revenue bond, then again, how is it different from what we have already in the portfolio? So this is just the summary of these points. Again, it has to be a specifically designed instrument for the country's diaspora. There may not be always competitively priced. So the patriotic discount is something we try to see or find, and it sort of existed in Israel's original sort of offers. But third, there's this transparency and specific use purpose for diaspora bonds, which the contract with diaspora is important because it is about, comes back for me at least, comes back to trust, and is about identity and engagement infrastructure over time. So this is all in continuum. Now here's how this happens. If I can continue. Oh, well, maybe it's somewhat mathematical thinking. But,
I like the identity and engagement infrastructure over time.
Right, because things change. Again, it takes one action that is misunderstood by either side for this relationship to be broken. Because one thing that we need to understand is that diasporas don't owe anyone anything. Simply because the times we live in. It was an individual choice to move. Now, migration is rarely happening out of luxury, but still, it was an individual choice to move. When individuals build themselves in host country, right, the country different from their native land, there's very psychological and sociological changes that start to occur, right? And we need to be aware of that. And so the bulk of the work, really 99% of all the work around here, is on the country that is hoping to connect with its diaspora. And this brings me to engagement infrastructure. In studying how India opened up and how it benefited from its diaspora in the development of its, starting with IT sector and so on, across the literature, there's something that's sort of to be put in a diagram that is interesting in terms of a pattern, right? It starts with the existence of a diaspora network and its significance, because it could be just in, if we think in terms of very stereotypical, if we can, labor migration, it could be initially just a collection, a gathering of individuals from similar rural areas who are just exchanging, and you know, they're happy to find someone whom they can relate to, someone from their native lands. But gradually, this informal gathering may start to evolve into something else. For example, Moldova has hometown associations which help the recent labor migrants to channel their remittances back to Moldova into rural areas, into development of the villages and economic development projects there. Okay, so in the case of India, it was a lot of mid-tier managers in the Silicon Valley, right? Second, they were working in Silicon Valley. So already they are endowed with what Branko Milanovic would refer to as a citizenship premium, right? In other words, having access to greater resources, infrastructure, networking, and so on. So that's important. Again, the third point comes back to the informality, because again, we could still have the managers working together in top companies, but are they creating anything that would be a formal diaspora entity? And that's, for example, the Moldova's hometown associations, or India's, I think it was the Indus Tech organization, if I remember correctly. And then the last point is the connection with the home country. And this is where the attitudes towards diaspora or demand for diaspora potential has to be evaluated, right? And we have to be objective here. Yeah. Diaspora members may have certain views, home country, business people or politicians, of course, may have slightly different views. And how they work these out is critical. Now, in the case of India, there was significant opening and conditions created for the diaspora to move forward. Something similar was done in Ireland, and I learned from my colleagues in Ireland. And just one example is the Ireland Funds, which tried to fundraise and has continued to fundraise and has been successful in doing so from the global Irish diaspora. So we are creating conditions, but we're not just taking the money. We're not just saying, come live here or work here. We are actually reporting how each sort of action contributes to the country's development, how each of these actions integrate within the strategy of economic development of the country. And that's
the key. Yeah.
So this brings me to, relatively speaking, conclusion on why not. Number one, risk outweighs returns, and history is important. Ethiopia's example is one, but one could say, okay, well, they didn't register. We will register ours with SEC. Okay, but then there are examples of Pakistan or Ghana that have tried, but because of the lack of interest from pure diaspora individuals, or in other words, people living abroad, but also sort of risk aversion and lack of trust didn't really work out. In other words, simply having a diaspora is not sufficient, again, here, right? Because as I mentioned, not all migration leads to that interest in reconnecting with ancestral home. Also, if we we can use the term diaspora for sort of generic descriptions, but we should understand this does not imply sort of a unison action or action in one spirit towards the ancestral home. And there's something else. I don't remember if I have that outlined anywhere specifically, but the reason why it is migration times history is because we also have waves of old, or pockets rather, networks of old diaspora, which are being supplemented now with new diaspora, so new migrants that are coming from that country. Now, the old diaspora, as in the case of Armenia, for example, or even Ireland, perhaps, may have references in their collective memory, historical memory, towards parts, geographic parts, which may not be part of the current country called Armenia, let's say, right? And so that is somewhat of a disconnect in terms of a connection with, okay, what are the troubles in Republic of Armenia? Okay, that's really not of my concern, even though I could be Armenian. And this is quite common. We can find examples in other places as well. In more sort of robust terms, strategically, we need to understand how this new responsibility is delivering something other than what is already done, because our country could already, in fact, all of them are. Guyana is a borrower, Armenia is a borrower, so they already have created through regular external debt sort of programs, they've already created their debt profile that the markets understand. And this is and evaluate. And this is where the risk outweighs the returns. Because if the record of the countries in, let's say, Ghana, Kenya, is anything to go by, if a small country like Guyana or Armenia issues a diaspora bond and it is undersubscribed so significantly, right, then it's going to spill trouble. Because Goldman Sachs would say, how come the people who are supposed to be most invested in your development are not providing the money, right? I'm just using Goldman Sachs as an example. No, it could be any other bank, anyone that a country is working with. In the case of Guyana, again, I mentioned oil. That could be a resource that could still make slight difference, but you still have to be careful. This is where tactically you need to have transparency. And if it's a diaspora bond, you may want to have diaspora members participating in the design of that product. Again, that's where we can learn from Israel. And then lastly, well, the third point here is the integration of this financing program in the broader development framework. Because remember, if we're pitching this to affluent diaspora members, they've already made their money. They have all they want, pretty much. They're not doing this to generate a return, not necessarily, and 80% not, probably. They are going to agree to invest from $100 to $1,000 to $10,000, depending on the ranges, if they understand how their money is going to help that country. So that's where, again, more work has to be done by the country. I have this data from a survey which I did, actually 2 surveys. One was on Lebanese diaspora, and we have a paper in Review of Development Economics coming up soon. But another survey, which actually led that first one, is the Armenian diaspora survey, where I ask these specific questions, and I see those answers. In the end, very little of diaspora bond aspects comes straightforward from financial indicators and such, because there are attempts to estimate that. And almost all of it is defined by the country's connection with its diaspora and sort of working through the social capital linkages across the old and the new diasporas. I think I will stop here.
Yeah, thank you. You've given a lot to chew on. I really thank you very, very much. this has been quite educational for me, and I'm sure for a number of the folks in the audience, this has been really an education. And it raises, I think, what would be the challenge for, say, a Guyana attempting to do this. And so there were maybe two questions. I've also noted the time is sort of fast slipping out on us, but there are two questions I'd like to impose upon you to give a think on and give a thought on. So this trust that you mentioned is really, I think, the issue that would hurt anything like this within the context of Guyana, because the trust is really a challenge for a number of reasons. So I just, at the high level, what kinds of things have governments done to systematically maintain trust over time, or to rebuild trust when trust has been broken, and to sustain trust over time? What are some of the things that governments have done in that?
There are many different ways of what would be referred to as diaspora engagement. Ireland does Ireland Cultural Days, for example. Moldova and others have done, let's say, summer camps for children.
They invite the children of diaspora.
Right. This really works, though, better. This particular one works really better with most recent migrants, because they do have stronger connection with the country. Armenia has tried diaspora forums, but there are also existent organizations within the Armenian diaspora, sort of the old diaspora created groups that have sort of as their mission to support educational, cultural development of the country. And so they work, because they already have infrastructure here in the United States, let's say, or Europe, they work with their members, right, to raise funds, and then they build schools, they build tech centers, the tech training centers in Armenia, and so on. So it starts with simple connection on the topic of, let's say, common and shared culture, and then goes on only gets deeper, right? The most difficult effort would be for the consulates, the country consulates across different countries, to actually connect and engage with the diaspora members. But this is where things become somewhat uncomfortable, because, again, diaspora members tend to speak their mind openly.
Well, that's so there's one. I mean, permit me just give just a little beyond. It's a little beyond 11:30. Guyana is very interesting in this context. Guyana is an ethnically diverse place in which there are two large sort of racial ethnic groups, Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese. And I'm thinking, if from the perspective of a diaspora bond, so these communities have cooperated over time, but there are also lots of frictions between these two communities. I mean, for example, in New York City, one might find a significant portion of the Indo-Guyanese community living in a particular community, say in Richmond Hill in Queens, and one will find a significant proportion of the Afro-Guyanese community living, say, in Brooklyn. I'm interested in like how would you, if you were designing something, how would you design and market something that would in a way gather all of these communities that kind of operate perhaps separately in various places, sort of racially, geographically? So I'm also thinking, the Guyanese community in Washington, D.C., the Guyanese community in Atlanta, Guyanese community in Florida, Guyanese community in New York, Guyanese community in Toronto, Guyanese community in the UK. How what's the technical work that gets done in terms of something that would target all of those communities, not just the community in New York City?
It's only the legwork. The legwork by the officials or their representatives or whoever is involved in, if we're talking about Diaspora Bond, whoever is involved in, or any type of fundraising, by the way. The Diaspora Bond is
It has to be issued in a particular
right.
place.
It has to be right. It has to be done
Yeah.
as a government debt security. So there are a lot of restrictions. But if we're just fundraising, then again, a lot of legwork by those agencies, organizations that are trying to raise the funds, and the connection probably should, but this is just my high-level opinion, should probably be on the future of Guyana. I'm assuming that the groups that these people are going to be meeting with have some sort of ties, or still remaining ties with the country. So they're not indifferent to what happens to the country. But this legwork would also imply that someone is actually learning more about the differences, because it is probably one thing when people live, let's say in Guyana, right, are accustomed to live in a certain way, but there's another thing when it is transposed or sort of superimposed on a different country. In this case, what you mentioned, this example, New York City, Brooklyn versus Richmond Hill.
Yeah.
Are there any connections between the two communities? Because if there are none, well, that's going to be difficult, but adds more to the government's work in terms of connecting with those communities. So that's the technical sort of, I think, in my opinion, technical work that has to be done.
Doctor, this has been Dr. Aleksandr.
Yeah.
Gevorkyan, this has been a really wonderful conversation. I really want to thank you a lot for the work. I think what you're sort of revealing is the complexity of diaspora engagement, which is the sort of question that I've been thinking about for these last couple of years.
It is very complex, and yeah, it is, but it is an incredibly exciting topic that I think, even though I use the why not, I think we should still try to learn, and adapt. Maybe I should add that to my slide, because we should really adapt rather than just think in sort of restricted
terms. Yeah, because I do think, Guyana has this unique demographic, this economic transformation being driven by oil. And I think as I listen to you, I sort of, the key insights, the diaspora bonds, really, they're not just a financial instrument, but they're really a contract around trust and identity.
Yep.
And, the success really would depend on some, transparency, some specific purpose, and some genuine engagement between, home and diaspora. And what I see though is that, like Guyana's oil economy could function like the guarantee for the Israeli bonds that the U.S. government provides. And
if the lobbying efforts can be so successful, then why not?
Yeah.
I just want I know we're running out of time. I
welcome that. My next starts at noon, but
okay.
I was worried about not overimposing on your time.
Oh, no, I'm fine. But I do want to acknowledge and thank all the colleagues that I see posting questions in the chat room.
Yeah.
Professor Della Worrell, Martin Russell, these two I know. I'm also thankful to everyone else. And there's a reminder for us to talk about the private sector from can see Fidel. And I think what is interesting here, just sort of very briefly and really spontaneously thinking about this, is that it is possible, just like any corporation could issue debt. So the oil producing company in Guyana could issue its debt and call it a diaspora bond. The question comes sort of in two parts. Part number one, what is the government's obligation in this? You have to always think from the budget side. And will that have, and related to that, will that be tied to the country of Guyana's sovereign debt profile, ratings, ability to fundraise, the cost of borrowing when they try on their own? Related to the same point is, how are the proceeds going to be distributed, right? Is it going to stay in private hands, or will that be somehow shared with government? But then the other part is also, well, if we are giving so much sort of autonomy to a private sector company to issue a diaspora bond, what are we doing then?
Yeah.
And how this company will connect with the diaspora, given the complications that you mentioned. So
I want to
some
note.
thoughts on that.
I just want to note the Martin Russell's comment. So the launch of a diaspora institute in Ireland. You know, there is a similar kind of diaspora, but maybe at the University of Guyana, there's a similar sort of intellectual effort going on around the diaspora at the University of Guyana. So there's a lot of thinking in it, and I would really love to continue this conversation with you, because
Likewise.
I think Guyana presents some really interesting questions that can potentially energize this work intellectually, but also have some significant impact on the lives of Guyanese. So, you know, I want to again thank you for this conversation. Maybe one last question, if I can impose upon you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
You know, so it's like, what would be, like, let's say you wanted to do a diaspora bond, what would be your most important first step in designing a diaspora bond? But I want to add this caveat that could unite and mobilize the Guyanese diaspora. I mean, so let's say you had a fractured diaspora and you thought, I wanted not only to borrow money, but I wanted somehow to have my diaspora cohere in a certain manner, and I wanted to use this as a what would be your first step?
I would start with building. Let me try to choose the right words. Let's start to building, essentially constructing an understanding within the country, within my government, that this is important.
I see.
Because if we believe that this is important, then we can convey that belief to others who are more skeptical. It's not like, example of Israel, sort of somebody woke up and said, let's borrow from the diaspora. There was a lot of apprehension. There was a lot of hesitation for various different political economy reasons and so on. But it took really some convincing, right, and true dedication of people from the country who were driving this initiative to jumpstart. And then once you have a first or second successful issue, then things start to build up, because that's the trust element. The trust starts to build up. Oh, they actually are putting this money to the intended use. Oh, I can actually see the progress. What I find in a lot of post-socialist countries, especially that have introduced some diaspora institutions or instruments, is that the diaspora member visiting this country says, we've given this country so much money. Why the roads are still so bad? It's all very, again, this is not sort of high-level macro talk. This is all very, very on the ground. And that's where there needs to be an understanding within the country that what we're doing, it's minor. It's, you know, having, growing more trees and improving the parks. Well, that's important, because that's what diaspora investor sees, and this is their point of reference. Again, they're not doing this for the money. They're doing this to help the country develop. So that's this first step. If we understand it, then we can, all the technical instruments, like what if you have in mind financial markets, they're already in place. So that will be more of an automatic sort of, and already schematic process.
I deeply appreciate. I think that's a good takeaway. That really, if you want to do a diaspora policy, really you need to have the understanding at home and within the government that intends to do that, clear consensus, and to the extent that you don't have that clear consensus within the government in the home country, then it's very difficult to have a real, not just a diaspora bond, but really a kind of diaspora strategy as a general proposition. Dr. Aleksandr, I want to thank you again on behalf of the folks here at the Guyana Business Journal, and I want to thank our listeners for coming in. And if there's anything you want to say, I'll have you be the person who gets the last word.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Terence, for inviting and hosting this conversation. Very much enjoyed. And every time I ask to talk about Diaspora Bonds, something new comes up. And so I hope I made new friends from this talk, because I'm very thankful for the comments. And already we have some suggestions on, on how to proceed with this. So I hope this conversation continues, and happy to come back and if I can be in any way helpful here.
Thank you very much. Have a wonderful, wonderful
All right.
evening.
Well, thank you and good luck.
Bye.
Bye.